The Galactic Consortium held the survival trials once every 100 years. It was not a game. It was not entertainment. It was a test, and the stakes were higher than most species could imagine. Win, and your world earns a seat at the great table of galactic power. Lose, and your planet faces sanctions that could starve billions. Some called it unfair. The consortium called it necessary. Ambassador Kethvara of the Veloci Dominion stood in the observation deck, watching the arriving ships through the massive viewport. His scale shifted from green to a satisfied blue as he counted the competitors. 12 species this cycle. 12 chances to prove worth. 12 opportunities for failure. The Veloci had won 3 of the last 5 trials. They stood 8 feet tall, covered in armored scales, with claws that could tear through steel and venom glands that delivered death in seconds. Evolution had made them perfect predators. "Ambassador," his aide said, pointing at a small transport ship docking at the station. "The humans have arrived." Kethvara's scales flickered with amusement. He had studied the humans. Soft skin that tore easily. No claws, no fangs, no venom. No natural armor. They could not see in the dark. They could not smell danger approaching. They could not hear the frequencies that warned of predators. "What are their odds?" he asked. "The betting pools give them a 0.3% chance of survival, Ambassador." Kethvara let out a low hiss of laughter. "Generous." The human delegation walked into the main hall, and every species present turned to look. There were 42 of them, led by a woman with dark hair and cold eyes. She wore simple gray clothing and carried nothing visible. No weapons, no armor, nothing. The Shethkai delegates clicked their crystalline bodies in what passed for mockery among their kind. They were a hive mind species, thousands of individual bodies sharing one consciousness. What one saw, all saw. What one learned, all learned. They moved in perfect coordination, never bumping into each other, never hesitating. The Korgans simply stared with their 4 eyes. They came from a heavy gravity world, and their bodies had adapted accordingly. Thick shells covered their backs and limbs, harder than most metals. They were slow but nearly impossible to kill. Patience was their weapon. The human woman met Kethvara's gaze across the hall. She did not look away. She did not look afraid. Strange, he thought. Prey should know when it is Outmatched. The consortium's chief adjudicator, an ancient being whose species had transcended physical form millennia ago, appeared as a column of light at the center of the hall. "The survival trials will commence in one standard rotation," the adjudicator announced. "All competitors will be transported to Nexus 7. The rules are simple. Survive 30 planetary rotations. There will be no rescue. There will be no assistance. There will be no mercy." Nexus 7. Kethvara knew the planet well. Acid rain fell for 6 hours every day. The atmosphere was toxic to most oxygen breathers. The megafauna hunted anything that moved, and the plants themselves were often more dangerous than the animals. It was a death world, specifically chosen because survival there required more than just strength. It required being the apex predator. The human woman raised her hand. The hall fell silent. No one interrupted the adjudicator. "Question," she said, her voice flat. "Are there any restrictions on tactics?" The adjudicator's light pulsed. "You may do whatever is necessary to survive. The only rule is survival itself." The woman nodded once. "Good." Kethvara watched her with new interest. There was something in her voice. Not confidence exactly. Something colder. Something that did not match the soft, fragile body that housed it. The transport ships carried all 12 species to Nexus 7 and dropped them at random points across the planet's largest continent. Kethvara's Veloci team landed in a dense jungle region, immediately establishing dominance over the local predators. Within hours, they had marked territory, built a defensible position, and begun hunting. The HFY collective landed in an open plain and spread out in perfect formation, their hive mind allowing them to cover massive amounts of ground while remaining connected. They found food, water, and shelter with mechanical efficiency. The Korgan chose a mountain range, using their shells to shield against the acid rain while they slowly, methodically fortified a cave system. The humans landed in a rocky wasteland at the edge of a toxic swamp. 3 other species were eliminated within the first rotation. The Nephics, a fast-breeding insectoid race, ran directly into a megafauna nesting ground. The Pelori, who relied on psychic abilities, discovered that Nexer 7's native life was immune to mental influence. The Gren, amphibious beings who needed water to survive, found that the planet's lakes were more acid than water. Kethvara received reports from consortium drones tracking all competitors. The Veloci were thriving. The HFY were expanding. The Korgan were fortifying. The humans had simply vanished. The drones could not find them. Heat signatures showed nothing. Movement sensors detected nothing. It was as if 42 soft, fragile, defenseless creatures had simply ceased to exist. They are dead, his aide concluded. The swamp must have taken them. Ketvara stared at the empty sensor readings. His scale shifted to an uncertain yellow. Perhaps, he said slowly, or perhaps they do not wish to be found. His aide clicked in confusion. Why would prey hide from the hunt? Ketvara did not answer. He was remembering the woman's eyes, the coldness in them, the way she had asked about restrictions on tactics for the first time in his long career. Ambassador Ketvara felt something he did not recognize. Later, he would learn that the feeling was called doubt by Rotation 10. The observation deck had grown crowded. Ambassadors from dozens of species had gathered to watch the trials, and the mood had shifted from amusement to something else entirely, something that looked like fear. The humans had reappeared, not as refugees, not as desperate survivors clinging to life. They emerged from the toxic swamps wearing armor made from the shells of creatures they had killed. They carried weapons fashioned from bone and stone and plant fiber that somehow resisted the acid rain. They found water sources that the consortium's own surveys had missed. They had built shelters that could withstand storms that killed species twice their size, and they had tamed the swamp wolves. The swamp wolves of Nexer 7 were apex predators, 6-legged hunters that worked in packs and could bring down prey 10 times their size. Every species that had ever competed in the trials had learned to avoid them. The humans had learned to ride them. Ambassador Ketvara watched the footage with his scales locked in a pale, sickly gray. How is this possible? The consortium's eldest observer, a being so old that no one remembered what species it had originally been, floated beside him. They learn, it said. They learn faster than anything we have ever documented. In 10 rotations, they have adapted to conditions that take most species generations to master. But they have no advantages, Ketvara protested. No natural weapons. No defenses. That is precisely why they are so dangerous. The observer's voice was soft, almost sad. When you were born with claws, you never learned to make a knife. When you were born with armor, you never learned to build walls. When you were born with venom, you never learned to brew poison. Humans were born with nothing, so they learned to make everything. Commander Yara Chun led her squad of 42 through the jungle with cold precision. They had lost no one. Not a single human had died in 10 rotations on a death world. She had divided her people into teams. Scouts who mapped the terrain and identified threats. Hunters who tracked and killed the creatures they needed for food and materials. Builders who constructed shelters and defenses. Scientists who studied everything they encountered. Looking for weaknesses to exploit, the Veloci hunting pack found them on the 11th rotation dot, there were 30 Veloci warriors, led by a scarred veteran named Dexcor. They had tracked the humans for 2 days, following the strange scent trails and the marks left by the swamp wolves. When they finally cornered the human camp at the edge of a canyon, Dexcor felt nothing but satisfaction. "Soft prey," he announced to his pack. "Easy kills. We end this now." The humans did not run. They did not beg. They simply watched as the Veloci surrounded them, scales shifting to predatory red, venom dripping from extended claws. Commander Chun stepped forward. "You have one chance to walk away." Dexcor laughed, a hissing sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "Walk away? From prey? We are not prey." The Veloci attacked. They were fast, faster than anything the humans could match. Their claws could tear through armor. Their venom could kill in seconds. They had won 1,000 battles on 100 worlds. They had never faced humans. The first line of Veloci hit the tripwires and fell into pits lined with sharpened stakes coated in a thick black substance. The substance was harvested from a plant that grew in the toxic swamps, and the humans had discovered that it paralyzed Veloci nervous systems on contact. The warriors screamed as their bodies locked up, leaving them helpless at the bottom of the pits. The second line of Veloci tried to circle around, but the humans had set fires. Not small fires. Walls of flame that cut off every escape route except one, a narrow path that led directly into a killing ground. Fire. The Veloci had abandoned fire thousands of years ago. It was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too destructive. No civilized species used fire as a weapon. Humans were not civilized. Dexcor led the charge down the narrow path, determined to reach the humans and tear them apart before the flames consumed his warriors. He did not see the nets until they fell. He did not see the humans with their bone spears until they struck. He did not understand what was happening until he was on the ground, a human standing over him with a blade pressed against his throat. "We studied you," Commander Chun said quietly. "We learned your patrol patterns. We identified your venom glands and found a plant that neutralizes them. We mapped the exact angles of your joints and designed weapons to exploit the gaps in your scales." Dexcor stared up at her with dying eyes. "How?" "Because that is what humans do. We observe. We learn, we adapt, and then we kill." Of 30 Veloci warriors, 3 survived. Chun let them go deliberately, watching them flee into the jungle with wounds that would take weeks to heal. Why? One of her squad asked. Why let them live? Chun's expression did not change. Because they will tell the others. They will describe what happened here. They will spread fear. In the observation deck, Ambassador Kethvara watched the footage in silence. His scales had gone completely white, a color the Veloci only showed in the presence of death. "They did not just win," he whispered. "They did not just survive. They systematically dismantled our finest warriors using weapons and tactics that should not exist." The eldest observer drifted closer. "Now do you understand?" Kethvara turned to face it. "Understand what?" "Why the galaxy fears them. Not because they are strong. Because they refuse to accept weakness. They take it as a personal insult and spend every moment finding ways to overcome it." The observer paused. "They are born losing, Ambassador. So they have learned to do anything, absolutely anything, to win." On the surface of Nexus 7, Commander Chun watched the retreating Veloci with cold satisfaction. 42 humans had entered the trials. 42 humans remained, and they were just getting started. Rotation 20 arrived with blood-red skies, an acid rain that fell for 12 straight hours. Only 4 species remained in the trials. The humans, the Shefkai Hive, the Korgan Heavy Worlders, and a small broken contingent of Veloci who had abandoned hunting entirely and now focused only on survival. The HFY Queen sent her message on rotation 19. It came through one of the collective scout bodies, a crystalline being that walked into the human camp with no weapons and no fear. The hive mind did not understand fear. The hive mind did not understand fear. Individual bodies were meaningless. Only the collective mattered. "We propose alliance," the scout said, its voice carrying the harmonics of thousands of minds speaking in perfect unity. "Together, we guarantee mutual survival. The trials do not require elimination, only that survivors remain." Commander Chun listened to the proposal with her head tilted slightly, the way she did when she was thinking. Her squad watched in silence. They had learned not to interrupt her thinking. "What do you offer?" Chun asked finally. "Resources, information. The collective has mapped 73% of the continent. We know where the Korgan have fortified. We know where the remaining Veloci hide. We know which predators control which territories. And what do you want from us?" The scout's crystalline body caught the dim light, fracturing it into rainbows. "Protection. Your tactics against the Veloci were effective. The collective lacks such creativity. We propose that you defend our outer bodies while we provide intelligence and coordination." Chun nodded slowly. "We accept." The alliance lasted 3 rotations. During that time, the humans and the HFY worked together with remarkable efficiency. The hive mind provided information, and the humans used it to establish secure positions across the territory. Food was shared. Water sources were protected. The collective even helped the humans improve their shelters using crystalline secretions that hardened into acid-resistant barriers. On the surface, it looked like cooperation. Underneath, something else was happening. The humans asked questions. Endless questions. How did the hive mind communicate? What frequencies carried the neural signals? How far apart could individual bodies travel before losing connection to the collective? What happened when a body was isolated? The HFY answered freely. They had no concept of deception. The hive mind shared everything with itself. So the idea of hiding information from allies seemed strange and inefficient. On rotation 23, the humans struck. It happened during the rest cycle, when the hive mind reduced its activity to conserve energy. The collective had explained this process in detail. How the neural frequencies slowed, how individual bodies became less responsive, how the queen entered a semi-dormant state to manage the strain of controlling so many minds. The humans had listened. The humans had learned. The humans had prepared. They used a device built from salvaged consortium technology and crystalline components taken from dead HFY bodies. It generated a pulse that disrupted the specific neural frequency the hive mind used for coordination. The pulse lasted only 3 seconds. It was enough. Across the HFY territory, individual bodies suddenly found themselves alone. For beings who had never experienced isolation, who had existed since birth as part of something greater, the effect was devastating. Some simply stopped moving, overwhelmed by the silence in their minds. Others ran in random directions, unable to coordinate, unable to think clearly, unable to understand what had happened. The queen screamed, not through her neural network, which was shattered, through her physical voice, a sound that none of the collective had ever used before. It was a sound of pure, absolute terror. Commander Chun stood over the queen's body as dawn broke over. Nexus 7. The crystalline form was cracked and dim, its light fading as the connection to its bodies dissolved permanently. "Why?" The queen managed, her voice now singular and small. "We were allies. We helped you." Chun's expression did not change. "You were a threat we did not yet understand. Now we understand you completely. We trusted you. Yes, that was your mistake. The remaining HFY bodies scattered into the wilderness, alone for the first time in their species' existence. Without the hive mind, they were easy prey for the planet's predators. Within 2 rotations, none remained in the observation deck. The eldest observer watched the footage without comment. Ambassador Kethvara had stopped watching days ago. He could not bear to see any more. The Korgan commander, a massive being named Grontek, received the reports from his scouts and felt something cold settle into his shell. He had fortified his position perfectly. His warriors were arranged in an unbreakable phalanx, their shells locked together to form a wall that nothing could penetrate. They had supplies to last 30 more rotations. They had water. They had everything they needed to simply wait out the trials. But now he understood something terrible. They did not defeat the HFY, he said slowly, his 4 eyes fixed on the distant human camp. They studied them first. They made allies specifically to find weaknesses. His lieutenant clicked in confusion. We have no weaknesses. Our shells cannot be broken. Grontik did not respond. He was thinking about the neural pulse, about the fires, about the poison that paralyzed Veloci nervous systems. The humans did not simply fight. They researched. They experimented. They found the one thing that each species relied upon for survival, and then they destroyed it. What did the Korgan rely upon? Their shells, their patience, their ability to simply wait while others exhausted themselves. Grontik looked at his fortified cave system, at his unbreakable warriors, at his perfect defensive position. For the first time in his long life, he felt afraid. Humans did not fight wars, he realized. They conducted exterminations. And now they were coming for him. Rotation 29 began with silence. The acid rain had stopped. The predators had retreated to their dens. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the planet itself was waiting for something. Commander Grontik stood at the entrance of his cave system and watched the human camp in the valley below. They had arrived 3 rotations ago and simply stopped. No attacks, no approaches, no communication. They just waited. His scouts reported that the humans had positioned themselves at every water source within a day's travel. They had built structures at the cave system's secondary exits, blocking them without attacking. They had set fires in patterns that filled the lower tunnels with smoke, not enough to kill, but enough to make breathing difficult. They were not attacking. They were squeezing. We can outlast them, his lieutenant insisted. We have supplies. We have water. Our shells protect us from everything. Grontik said nothing. He was watching the human commander, the woman with cold eyes, as she sat perfectly still outside her shelter. She was reading something. A book, perhaps, or a datapad. She looked relaxed. Patient. The patience terrified him more than any weapon. On rotation 27, the first water container ran dry. The humans had found the underground stream that fed into the cave system and poisoned it. Not with something that killed quickly. With something that made the water taste wrong. That caused stomach pain and weakness over time. On rotation 28, 3 of his warriors died. Not from wounds. From the smoke. They had been in the lower tunnels too long, and their lungs had finally given out. The Korgan had never worried about breathing. Their shells protected them from everything. Almost everything. We could charge them, his lieutenant suggested. Break through their lines. Our shells can withstand any weapon they have. Grontik looked at his warriors. They were weak, hungry, dehydrated. Their shells were as strong as ever, but the bodies inside those shells were failing. The humans had not needed to break them. They had simply waited for the Korgan to break themselves. On rotation 29, Grontik made his decision. He gathered his remaining warriors, 18 out of the original 40, and led them to the cave entrance. The sunlight hurt his eyes. The fresh air burned his damaged lungs. But he walked forward anyway, because the alternative was dying in the dark. The humans were waiting in a semicircle, weapons ready. They did not attack. They did not advance. They simply watched as the Korgan emerged from their fortress, blinking and stumbling in the light. Commander Chan stepped forward. Her face showed nothing. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just the same cold patience she had shown from the beginning. "Surrender," she said. "You will live." Grontek let out a sound that might have been a laugh. The consortium does not allow surrender. Only survival or death. The consortium is not here. Chan's voice was flat. "I am." He looked at his warriors. They were soldiers. They had trained their entire lives for combat. They had never lost a battle. But they had never faced an enemy like this. An enemy who did not fight fairly. An enemy who turned their greatest strength into their greatest weakness. How? Grontek asked. "How did you know about the water? The tunnels? The smoke?" Chan tilted her head. "We watched. We learned. You relied on your shells, so we found ways to attack what was inside them. You relied on patience, so we were more patient. You relied on defense, so we made your fortress into a prison. We have done nothing to you. We pose no threat. You existed. In a competition for survival, that is threat enough." Grontek stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he lowered himself to his knees. His warriors followed, one by one, until all 18 Korgan were kneeling before creatures half their size. Chan nodded once. "Smart choice." The survival trials ended on rotation 30. The consortium's drones recorded the final moments and transmitted them to the observation deck, where ambassadors from 100 species watched in stunned silence. 42 humans had entered the trials. 42 humans remained. They had not lost a single member of their group. They had eliminated 3 species entirely and forced another to surrender. Ambassador Kethvara stood before the emergency session of the Galactic Consortium, his scales shifting through colors that had no names. He had spent 3 rotations preparing his report. He had watched every recording. He had analyzed every tactic. He still did not fully understand what he had witnessed. "They are not strong," he began, his voice hollow. "They are not fast. They are not armored or venomous. They possess no natural advantages whatsoever." The assembly waited in silence. "This is what makes them the most dangerous species we have ever encountered." Kethvara paused, gathering his thoughts. "They have no natural advantages, so they create their own. They steal ours. They turn the environment itself into a weapon. And they never stop. They never hesitate. They never show mercy unless mercy serves their purpose." He looked around the assembly at the representatives of species who had dominated the galaxy for millennia. "We called them prey. We gave them a 0.3% chance of survival. We laughed at their soft skin and their lack of claws." His scales went completely white. "We were fools." The consortium voted unanimously. Humanity would receive a Senate seat, not as a reward for their victory, not as recognition of their worth, as containment, as a way to keep them close where they could be watched and managed, because the alternative was unthinkable. Making enemies of a species that treated extinction as a competitive sport. That learned faster than any other race in recorded history. That saw every weakness as a problem to be solved and every opponent as a puzzle to be taken apart. On Earth, Commander Yar Chun received the news with a thin smile. She had known from the beginning how this would end. The trials were not about strength or speed or natural weapons. They were about one thing only. Survival. And humans had been surviving against impossible odds since they first crawled out of the caves. Every predator that had hunted them was now extinct. Every environment that had challenged them was now conquered. Every species that had underestimated them had learned, eventually, what that mistake cost. The galaxy would learn too. 42 humans had entered the trials. 42 humans had left. They had offered mercy exactly once, to an enemy who had already been defeated, because mercy was not weakness to humans. It was a tool, like fire, like poison, like patience. Something to be used when it served a purpose and withheld when it did not. The consortium thought they were containing humanity. By giving them a seat at the table, they were wrong. They had just invited the wolf into the fold.